A millionaire is interrupted by a poor boy during a meeting. A desperate request changes the course of their lives. A shocking revelation about the past leaves the millionaire in shock. He didn't know how much that boy would change his life. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Richard Morgan adjusted his pure silk Italian tie in front of the mirror in his office on the top floor of the Millennium building in the heart of New York City's financial district. His gray eyes, cold as a winter morning, scanned the impeccable silhouette reflected in the mirror. At 45, he personified the success he had so longed for. President of the country's largest real estate conglomerate, estimated fortune in billions, and an unshakable reputation in the market. The office, decorated in shades of gray and black, reflected his personality. Minimalist, organized, and with no room for sentimentality. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city he had helped transform with his luxurious developments. New York was his blank canvas, and each new project was a calculated brushstroke towards more profits. Mary, his assistant for over a decade, entered the room with a folder of documents. "Mr. Morgan, the investors are already waiting in the conference room. The New York Renaissance project is ready for presentation." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Some more letters from the residents of Cherry Blossom Gardens have also arrived." Richard dismissed the letters with an impatient gesture. "File them with the others. We don't have time for sentimentality. The project needs to move forward." He picked up his Italian leather briefcase and headed to the conference room, his steps echoing down the marble corridor like a perfectly adjusted metronome. The conference room was filled with executives in expensive suits and anxious expressions. The New York Renaissance project was the most ambitious in the company's history, the complete remodeling of a traditional neighborhood to make way for a complex of high-end commercial and residential buildings. The investment was astronomical, but the return promised to be even greater. Richard began his presentation with the precision of a surgeon. Graphs, financial projections, and digital models danced on the screens as he led investors through his vision. "Gentlemen, Cherry Blossom Gardens is a rough diamond waiting to be polished. In 24 months, we will transform a degraded area into the most modern real estate complex in North America." It was then that the door to the room burst open abruptly. A boy of about 12, wearing a worn school uniform and scuffed sneakers, burst into the room. His eyes, a familiar shade of gray, shone with determination despite the evident fear on his face. "Please, don't destroy our home." The boy's voice trembled, but he stood firm. "My grandmother is sick, and that's the only place we have. You can't just evict everyone." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. The boy's eyes, so similar to his own, seemed to pierce his carefully constructed soul of indifference. Mary hurried towards the boy, but Richard raised his hand, stopping her. "How did you get in here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I followed the executives when they came in. I needed to talk to you. Nobody listens to us. Nobody cares." The boy held a crumpled paper in his hands. "This is from the neighborhood newspaper. You're going to destroy the lives of hundreds of families." Richard approached the boy, feeling inexplicably drawn to that juvenile courage. Something about that boy deeply disturbed him, like a distant memory trying to surface. "What's your name?" he asked, ignoring the stunned looks of the executives. Michael Smith," the boy replied, raising his chin in defiance. The surname hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Smith, the same surname as hers. Coincidence, surely. It had to be. "Where do you live, Michael?" 127 Maple Street, with my grandmother, Mrs. Helen." The boy hesitated. "You can come see what our neighborhood is like. It's not what they say in these papers. It's our home." Richard looked at the executives, then at the boy, and made a decision that would change his life forever. "The meeting is suspended, gentlemen. We'll reschedule for tomorrow." Ignoring the protests, he turned to Michael. "I'm going to take you home, and I want to see this neighborhood for myself." As they walked to the elevator, Richard felt a whirlwind of emotions that he had kept under control for years. That boy had managed, in a few minutes, to do something that no one had achieved in decades: pierce his armor of indifference, and without him knowing at that moment, his life was about to change completely. Richard's Porsche Cayenne snaked through the increasingly narrow streets of Cherry Blossom Gardens, completely out of place in the surrounding landscape. Michael, sitting in the passenger seat, kept his eyes fixed on the window, as if standing guard over his territory. The silence inside the car was dense, loaded with unspoken words. "There, you can stop." Michael pointed to a simple house with peeling but well-maintained walls, with a small garden in front where daisies stubbornly bloomed, defying the aridity of the concrete around them. Richard parked, observing the environment with analytical eyes. The old houses, some over half a century old, told stories through their worn walls. Children played in the street, ladies chatted on sidewalks, and an atmosphere of community hung in the air, something his technical reports had never captured. "Grandma must be worried," Michael commented, getting out of the car. "She doesn't know I went to your office." Before Richard could respond, the door of the house opened, and a lady with grey hair and dignified posture appeared. Her eyes widened when she saw Michael getting out of a luxury car, but it was when her gaze met Richard that something extraordinary happened. She turned pale, leaning on the doorframe. "Richard Morgan," she pronounced his name as if reciting an ancient prayer. After so many years, the businessman felt the world spin. That voice, memories long buried, began to emerge. "Helen Smith." Michael looked confused from one to the other. "You know each other?" Helen regained her composure, although her hands still trembled slightly. "Michael, go inside and do your homework. I need to talk to Mr. Morgan." "But Grandma." "Now, Michael." Her voice was gentle but firm. Richard watched the boy enter the house reluctantly, and then turned his gaze to Helen. She had aged, but maintained the same dignity he remembered from 20 years ago when— "Come in, Richard," Helen invited, interrupting his thoughts. "We have a lot to talk about." The living room was small but cozy, with well-preserved old furniture and photographs on the walls. Richard sat rigidly on the sofa, feeling out of place in this environment so distant from his aseptic world of glass and steel. "Would you like some coffee?" Helen offered, more out of habit than cordiality. "No, thank you." Richard adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture he hadn't made in years. "Helen, I didn't know this neighborhood." "That we lived here?" Helen completed, sitting in the armchair across from him. "No, you wouldn't know. You cut all ties when you left." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with 2 decades of untold stories. Richard observed the room more closely, and his gaze was captured by a photograph on the wall. His heart stopped for an instant. It was Laura, his Laura, smiling at the camera with a baby in her arms. "No," he murmured, standing up abruptly. "It can't be." Helen followed his gaze and sighed deeply. "Michael is your son, Richard. Laura tried to tell you when she found out she was pregnant, but you had already blocked all contacts, changed your number, your address." Richard staggered, leaning against the wall. Fragments of memory hit him like shards. Laura, his first love, the girl from the architecture course who had won his heart before ambition took over his life. The abrupt breakup when he received the proposal to work for a large developer. The decision to cut all ties with his past to build his empire. Why did you never try to find me afterwards?" His voice came out hoarse. Helen stood up, going to an old desk. From there, she retrieved a worn folder. "Laura tried for years. She wrote letters, tried to make contact through acquaintances, but you had become inaccessible, protected by layers upon layers of secretaries and advisors." She opened the folder, revealing dozens of letters, some already yellowed by time. "She kept every attempt at contact, every news about you in the newspapers, even after she got sick." "Sick?" Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "Cancer," Helen responded softly. "She passed away 5 years ago. Michael was only 7 years old." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his choices crushing him. Outside, he could hear Michael's voice talking to someone, probably a friend, his son, the son he never knew he had. "And now you want to demolish our home?" Helen continued, her voice carrying a mixture of irony and sadness. "The last place where Laura lived, where your son grew up." Richard opened his eyes, facing Helen. For the first time in decades, tears threatened to well up. "I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." "No, you chose not to know," Helen replied without rancor. "You built walls so high around yourself, Richard, that you forgot to leave a door." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Michael's return. Richard quickly composed his expression, but something inside him had irrevocably broken. The empire he had built, the power he had accumulated, All seemed empty in the face of the revelation he had just received. Michael stopped at the door of the living room, observing the adults with curiosity. His eyes, Richard's eyes, shone with an unformulated question. "I need to go," Richard announced abruptly, standing up. He needed to think, needed to breathe. "But I'll come back tomorrow if you'll allow me." Helen nodded silently. As he walked to his car, Richard felt the weight of Helen and Michael's gazes on his back. Cherry Blossom Gardens, which until that morning was just another project on his desk, had transformed into the scene of his greatest debt to the past. The next morning, Richard didn't go to the office. For the first time in 15 years, he cancelled all appointments. Sitting in his penthouse apartment in Upper East Side with the city at his feet, he spread out on the marble floor the old photographs he kept locked in a safe, memories of a life he had deliberately abandoned. Among the images yellowed by time, one in particular made him stop, him and Laura on the campus of the architecture school. She smiled, her dark hair blowing in the wind, while holding a model of the project they had developed together, a community center that never left the paper. In the photo, his eyes shone with dreams different from those he ended up pursuing. The phone rang for the 10th time that morning. It was Mary again. "Mr. Morgan, the investors are demanding a position on the New York Renaissance project. Yesterday's meeting." "Cancel everything," he interrupted, his voice hoarse. "I need a few days." "But sir, the board is—" "Mary," he took a deep breath. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm asking for time. Can you do that for me?" The silence on the other end of the line was eloquent. In 2 decades of working together, Mary had never heard him speak like this. "Of course, sir. I'll reorganize your schedule." After hanging up, Richard picked up another photograph. In this one, Laura was in front of a historic building in downtown New York, gesturing animatedly, while explaining something about architectural preservation. She always argued that progress didn't have to mean destruction. "What happened to me, Laura?" he murmured to the photograph. The intercom rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was George, his driver for over a decade. "Sir, I brought the documents you asked for about Cherry Blossom Gardens." Richard went down to the garage. George handed him a thick folder full of papers. "I got everything that was available in the public archives about the neighborhood," George explained. "History, property records, resident profiles, also—" He hesitated. "I found some old news articles about Ms. Laura Smith." Richard raised his eyes sharply. "You knew?" George adjusted his cap, uncomfortable. "Not at the time, sir, but when you asked me to research, some things connected. She was quite a respected architect in the field of historical preservation." Back in the apartment, Richard immersed himself in reading. Cherry Blossom Gardens had been one of the first planned neighborhoods in New York, built in the 1940s. The houses, although simple, had historical value. Laura had written several articles advocating for their preservation. In a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago, she appeared in a photo, pregnant, during a protest against the demolition of a historic mansion. The text mentioned her fight for the preservation of the city's memory. Richard felt a lump in his throat as he realized that, at the time of the photo, she was carrying his child. His phone vibrated with a message from Helen. "Michael asked if you're coming today." Richard looked at the clock. It was almost 2 in the afternoon. He quickly replied, "I'll be there in an hour." Before leaving, he changed from his suit into more casual clothes, something he hadn't done in years. On the way to Cherry Blossom Gardens, he asked George to stop at a bookstore. He bought several books that he imagined a 12-year-old boy would like to read. Upon arriving at Helen's house, he found Michael sitting on the entrance steps, leafing through an old notebook. The boy raised his eyes, a mixture of hope and distrust in his gaze. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said simply. "I promised I'd come back," Richard replied, sitting down next to him. "What are you reading?" Michael hesitated before showing the notebook. "They're my mom's notes. She drew a lot. Grandma says I got that from her." Richard took the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were full of sketches of old buildings, squares, and architectural details. Among the drawings were notes about the importance of preserving the city's history. "Do you like to draw too?" he asked, trying to control the emotion in his voice. Michael nodded, taking a sketchbook out of his backpack. "I want to be an architect like she was." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He too had once dreamed of being an architect, before deciding that building fortunes was more important than building dreams. Helen appeared at the door, observing the scene with an indecipherable expression. "Michael, why don't you show Mr. Morgan around the neighborhood? He needs to see what he intends to destroy." The comment was sharp but fair. Michael stood up excitedly. "Can I show you the square first? It's where everyone gathers in the late afternoon." For the next 2 hours, Richard saw cherry blossom gardens through his son's eyes. The central square with its centennial trees, the small community library that Laura had helped found, the improvised cultural center where children learned music and art. On every corner, there was a story. In every house, a memory. Michael knew everyone by name, and everyone knew him. It was more than a neighborhood. It was a living, pulsating community. Exactly the kind of place that Laura had always advocated for. When they returned to Helen's house, the sun was starting to set. Michael ran inside to fetch something he wanted to show, leaving Richard and Helen alone on the porch. "He has a lot of her," Helen commented softly. "The same passion for this place, the same ability to see beauty where others see only decay." Richard nodded, unable to speak. His cell phone vibrated, another urgent message from the board of directors. But for the first time in his adult life, the numbers seemed insignificant in the face of what he was discovering. "I need to go," he finally said, "but I'll be back tomorrow. And the day after. I need to get to know my son." Helen studied him for a long time before responding. "He doesn't need an occasional visitor, Richard. He needs a father." The words accompanied him all the way back home, echoing in his mind along with the laughter of the children in the square, the sound of the life his project threatened to silence, and the weight of 20 years of absence that he would need to find a way to redeem. In the weeks that followed, Richard immersed himself in a completely new routine. Every morning, after resolving the most urgent company matters via video conference, he drove to Cherry Blossom Gardens. The afternoons were dedicated to Michael and to rediscovering a world he had left behind long ago. On a particularly sunny Saturday, Richard and Michael walked through Central Park, a green oasis not far from the neighborhood. The boy ran ahead, stopping occasionally to point out some tree or bird. "Mum used to bring me here every weekend," Michael commented, sitting by the lake. "She said it was important to remember that the city breathes too." Richard sat down next to him, watching the ducks swimming lazily. "Your mother was a very wise woman. Why did you never come to see us?" The question, so direct and innocent, caught Richard off guard. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Michael, sometimes adults make mistakes, big mistakes. I made choices that took me away from important people. At the time I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was." Michael was throwing pebbles into the water, creating concentric circles that expanded to the shore. "Mom always talked about you. Not with anger, you know. More like longing." The boy's words hit Richard like lightning. The idea that Laura, even after everything, still spoke of him with fondness was almost unbearable. "I wish I had known her better," Michael continued, "to have more memories." Richard hesitated for a moment before putting his hand on his son's shoulder. "How about we create some new memories? You, me, and your grandmother?" The smile Michael gave him was like a ray of sunshine breaking through heavy clouds. Back at Flower Garden, Richard noticed unusual activity. A group of residents had gathered in front of the old Neighborhood Association headquarters, a mansion that had served as a community meeting point for years. As they approached, Richard recognized Donna Zulaide, an energetic lady who led many of the neighborhood's community projects. She was arguing heatedly with a man in a suit, whom Richard recognized as one of the City Hall advisors. "What's going on?" he asked Michael. "It's about the mansion," the boy explained. "The City Hall wants to close it due to structural problems. But it's where we hold all our parties and neighborhood meetings." Richard approached the group, feeling the suspicious glances of the residents. Many already knew who he was and what his company had planned to do with the neighborhood. "Excuse me," he politely interrupted. "Can I help in any way?" Donna Zulaide looked at him with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "Unless you have about $200,000 for the renovation, I think it's difficult." The City Hall advisor cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "As I was explaining, the building needs urgent repairs. We can't risk the residents' safety." Richard observed the mansion. Despite the evident wear, the architecture was beautiful, a perfect example of the eclectic style from the early 20th century. He remembered how Laura used to get excited when talking about preserving historical heritage. And what if, he began, an idea forming in his mind, what if I committed to financing the renovation? The silence that followed was deafening. Donna Zuleide looked at him as if he had just said it would rain gold. You would do that? She asked, incredulous. Richard nodded, feeling a strange lightness. Yes, but with one condition. I want it to be a community project. The residents decide how they want the renovation, within technical needs, of course. The buzz of excitement that spread among the residents was interrupted by the skeptical voice of an older man. And why would we do that? Aren't you the same one who wants to demolish our neighborhood? Richard felt the weight of all eyes on him. Michael was watching him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. I've made many mistakes, Richard began, his voice more vulnerable than he had ever allowed in public. I spent years seeing only numbers, forgetting that behind them are people, stories, lives. This neighborhood, it means more than I imagined. To all of you, to my son, and to the memory of someone very special. He paused, searching for the right words. I can't undo the past, but I can try to do better from now on. This mansion can be a start, a chance to preserve something important, not just for you, but for the city. Donna Zuleide studied him for a long moment before extending her hand. Very well, Mr. Mendez. Let's see what you're capable of. That night, back in his apartment, Richard stared at the city through the window. The lights of São Paulo shone as always, but now he saw them differently. Each bright point represented a life, a story. His phone rang. It was Mariana. Mr. Mendez, the board is demanding an urgent meeting tomorrow. They want to know why the new São Paulo project is on hold. Richard took a deep breath. Schedule the meeting, Mariana. But first, I need you to do something for me. Find all the data we have on urban revitalization projects with historical preservation, and schedule a visit to Flower Garden for the entire board. Sir? Mariana's voice was full of confusion. Trust me, Mariana. I think it's time we rethink some things. As he hung up, Richard picked up Laura's sketchbook that Michael had lent him. Among the sketches of buildings and squares, he found a handwritten phrase. True architecture not only builds spaces, but preserves memories and creates futures. For the first time in years, Richard Mendez felt he was on the right path. The path to rebuild not just a neighborhood, but his own life. The meeting room at Mendez Incorporations was tense. The board members, usually impassive in their expensive suits, showed palpable restlessness. Richard entered, carrying a thick folder and a roll of architectural plans. Instead of his usual impeccable suit, he wore a simple dress shirt and khakis. A subtle change, but noticed by everyone. Gentlemen, he began, his voice firm, but with a new tone that few there would recognize as humility. Thank you for your presence. I know the last few weeks have generated many doubts and concerns. Carlos Alvarez, the oldest board member, didn't wait any longer to interrupt. Richard, let's get to the point. What's happening with the new São Paulo project? We have investors pressing for answers. Richard took a deep breath, unrolling the plans on the table. The new São Paulo project will no longer happen. At least, not as it was planned. A murmur of indignation ran through the room. Richard raised his hand, asking for silence. Instead, I'd like to present to you the Rebirth Project. In the following hours, Richard exposed his new vision. He talked about sustainable revitalization, about preserving history while building the future. He showed case studies of success in other cities around the world, where historical neighborhoods were renewed without losing their essence, becoming poles of tourism and culture. Imagine, he said, pointing to one of the maps, a neighborhood where restored historical buildings coexist with new constructions that respect the local architecture, where small traditional businesses flourish alongside innovative startups, a place that attracts both residents and visitors, that generates value not only financial, but cultural and social. As Richard spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The initial indignation gave way to cautious curiosity. Some board members were taking notes furiously, others whispered among themselves, mentally calculating the potential risks and benefits. But what about the financial return? Questioned Marcia Ribeiro, the company's CFO. A project of this scale with so many variables? Richard nodded, acknowledging the concern. It's a long-term investment, yes, but look at these numbers. He projected a series of graphs on the screen. Studies show that revitalized areas in this way tend to appreciate exponentially over the years. Moreover, the diversification of businesses and the tourist appeal create a more stable and sustainable income flow. The discussion extended for hours. Questions were asked, objections raised, alternatives proposed. Richard answered everything with a mixture of passion and pragmatism that surprised even his oldest collaborators. At the end, Carlos Alvarez stood up. The silence in the room was palpable. "Richard," he began, his voice grave, "in all these years working together, I've never seen you so alive." He paused, looking around the table. "It's a risky project, no doubt, but it's also visionary. And frankly, it's the kind of thing that can redefine not only our company, but the way we think about urban development in Brazil." One by one, the board members began to nod. It wasn't unanimous approval, but it was a start. Richard felt a huge weight lift from his shoulders. "There's one more thing," he said when the murmur died down. "I'd like to propose the creation of a new position in the company, a Preservation and Sustainable Development Directorate." Marcia frowned. "And who do you suggest for this position?" Richard smiled, for the first time since the beginning of the meeting. "Helena Santos, an architect with vast experience in historical preservation and community development." The name caused a commotion. Many there knew Richard's recent history, the rumors about a son he didn't know. "Richard," Carlos spoke softly, "are you sure about this? Mixing personal with professional—" "It's exactly what we need to do," Richard interrupted. "For years, we've treated business as something separate from real life, from people. It's time to change that." As he left the meeting room hours later, Richard felt exhausted but strangely light. Mariana was waiting for him outside, a look of concern on her face. "So?" she asked anxiously. Richard smiled. "We have a lot of work ahead, Mariana, but it's a new beginning." That night, sitting on Helena's porch, Richard watched Michael playing in the small garden. The boy was building an imaginary city with wooden blocks, his absolute concentration reminding him so much of Laura that it almost hurt. "Did they approve?" Helena asked, sitting next to him with 2 cups of coffee. Richard nodded. "Yes, including your position in the company if you accept." Helena was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on Michael. "You know," she began softly, "Laura always said you had a good heart underneath all that ambition. It seems she was right after all." The words hit Richard deeply. "I wasted so much time, Helena, so many years." "What matters is what we do from now on," she replied, gently placing her hand on his. "Michael needs a father, and this neighborhood, this city, needs people who see beyond immediate profit." As the sun set over Flower Garden, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Richard felt, for the first time in decades, that he was exactly where he should be. The path ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and obstacles, but also full of possibilities. It was time to rebuild, not just a neighborhood, but a family, a community, and perhaps an entire city. The following months brought a transformation, not only to Flower Garden, but to the entire dynamics of Mendez Incorporations. The Rebirth project had become the company's flagship, attracting national and even international attention as a model of sustainable urban revitalization. On a sunny spring afternoon, Richard walked through the neighborhood, observing with satisfaction the changes. The old Neighborhood Association mansion, now fully restored, housed a vibrant cultural center. Children were leaving music classes, elderly people participated in craft workshops, and young entrepreneurs animatedly discussed in a co-working space on the upper floor. "Mr. Richard," called Donna Zuleide, waving from the door of her newly renovated grocery store. "Come see what has arrived." Curious, Richard approached. Donna Zuleide, beaming, showed him an architecture magazine. On the cover, an aerial photo of Flower Garden, with the headline "Urban Revolution: How a Forgotten Neighborhood Became a Model of Sustainable Development." "Who would have thought, huh?" Donna Zuleide smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Our little neighborhood on the cover of such a fancy magazine." Richard flipped through the magazine, moved to see the photos, and read the residents' testimonials. It was confirmation that they were on the right path. Continuing his walk, Richard arrived at the central square, now a green oasis in the middle of the city. There he found Michael sitting on a bench, absorbed in an architecture book. "Hey, champ," called Richard, sitting next to his son. "What are you reading?" Michael looked up, smiling. "It's a book about sustainable architecture. You know, Dad, I've been thinking, When I grow up, I want to be an architect like Mom. I want to build things that help people and the planet. Richard felt a lump in his throat. It was as if Laura was there, speaking through their son. That's wonderful, Mum. I'm sure your mother would be very proud. At that moment, Helena approached, carrying a folder of documents. Good thing I found you two together, she said, sitting on the other side of Michael. I have important news. Richard and Michael looked at her, curious. I received an invitation from the University of São Paulo, Helena began, her voice mixing excitement and a touch of nervousness. They want me to lead a new program in sustainable urban revitalization, using Flower Garden as the main case study. Grandma, that's incredible, Michael exclaimed, hugging her. Richard nodded, genuinely happy for his mother-in-law. It's a wonderful opportunity, Helena. You more than deserve this recognition. Helena smiled, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes. The program would require full dedication. I would have to leave my position at Mendes Incorporations. A silence fell over the trio. Richard knew how much Helena had dedicated herself to the Rebirth project, how much her experience and vision had been crucial to its success. You should accept, Richard said finally, his voice firm. What you can teach and inspire in that position goes far beyond what we could do alone. It's a chance to multiply the impact of what we started here. Helena looked at him gratefully. Thank you, Richard. But what about the project? There's still so much to be done. And we'll do it, Richard assured. What we've built here is bigger than any of us. It's a legacy that will continue to grow. Michael, who had been listening to the conversation attentively, suddenly had an idea. Hey, what if we created an internship program? We could bring architecture and urban planning students to work on the project, learn in practice. That way, what we did here could inspire a new generation of architects. Richard and Helena looked at each other, surprised and proud of Michael's suggestion. You know what? Richard smiled, messing up his son's hair. I think we just found our next big idea. In the days that followed, the news of Helena's appointment to the university and the creation of the internship program spread through the neighborhood and the company. It was as if a new wave of energy and possibilities had been released. One night, as Richard worked in his home office, now located in Flower Garden, he found an old photo of Laura. In it, she smiled in front of one of her first restoration projects. We're doing this, my love, he murmured to the photo. Not in the way we originally planned, but I'm trying to honor your vision, your dream. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Michael in pajamas holding a sketchbook. Dad, can I show you something? Richard smiled, gesturing for his son to come in. Michael opened the sketchbook, revealing sketches of a futuristic building that harmoniously integrated with historical constructions. It's my idea for the new community center, Michael explained, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. See how it uses solar energy and has a rainwater collection system? And here, look, it's a vertical garden that helps purify the air. As Michael animatedly explained each detail of his project, Richard felt a wave of emotion envelop him. There was the future, not just of Flower Garden or Mendes Incorporations, but of a vision of a more humane and sustainable city. That night, as he lay down, Richard reflected on the incredible journey he had lived in the past few months. From a cold and calculating businessman focused only on profits, he had transformed into a man who rediscovered his humanity, his purpose, and most importantly, his role as a father. Flower Garden, once destined for demolition, now flourished as a symbol of renewal and hope. And at the center of it all was Michael, the son he almost never knew, now the beating heart of a new generation of dreamers and builders. With a smile on his lips, Richard fell asleep, feeling, for the first time in many years, truly at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, certainly, but also infinite possibilities. And he was ready to face them, with Michael by his side and Laura's spirit guiding his steps. The rising sun bathed Flower Garden in a golden light as Richard walked through the neighborhood streets. It was early, but the place was already pulsing with life. Shopkeepers were opening their stores, the aroma of fresh bread wafted from Donna Celeste's bakery, and students were heading to the newly inaugurated technical school. Richard stopped in front of a large billboard in the central square. On it, an image of the revitalized neighborhood next to a portrait of Laura, smiling and full of life. The text read, First Laura Santos Sustainable Architecture Festival, Building the Future, Honoring the Past. The festival, idealized by Michael and enthusiastically embraced by the community and Mendez Incorporations, was about to begin. For a week, Flower Garden would become the epicenter of discussions about sustainable urbanism, attracting architects, students, and curious people from all over the country. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," called Mr. Antonio, the grocery store owner, while sweeping the sidewalk. "Ready for the big day?" Richard smiled, waving. "Good morning, Mr. Antonio." "I think we're all a bit nervous, but excited too." Continuing his walk, Richard reflected on the past few months. The internship program suggested by Michael had been a resounding success. Young architects and urban planners from all over Brazil, and even from other countries, came to learn and contribute to the Rebirth project. The neighborhood was always full of new energy, fresh ideas, and contagious enthusiasm. When he arrived home, he found Michael already awake, bent over a model on the living room table. The boy looked up, a mixture of anxiety and excitement on his face. "Dad, do you think it's good? It's for today's afternoon presentation." Richard approached, examining the model carefully. It was a project to transform an old abandoned warehouse into a recycling and environmental education center. Every detail showed not only Michael's creativity, but also his deep understanding of the community's needs. "It's incredible, son," Richard replied, genuinely impressed. "Your mother would be so proud." Michael smiled, but Richard noticed a shadow pass over his eyes. "Sometimes I wish I had known her, you know, for real, not just through stories and photos." Richard sat down next to his son, putting his arm around his shoulders. "I know, champ. I wish she was here to see all this too, but in a way, she is. In every idea you have, in every dream we realize here in the neighborhood. Laura lives through us and the work we're doing." At that moment, Helena entered the room, already dressed for the festival's opening event. "You two need to hurry up. The ceremony starts in an hour." The central square of Flower Garden was unrecognizable. A stage had been set up, surrounded by stands where students and professionals exhibited innovative, sustainable architecture projects. Neighborhood residents mingled with visitors from everywhere, creating an animated buzz. When Richard took the stage for the opening speech, he felt the weight of hundreds of expectant gazes. He saw Michael and Helena in the front row, smiling encouragingly. He took a deep breath and began. "A year ago, if someone had told me that I would be here today, inaugurating a sustainable architecture festival in a neighborhood I had planned to demolish, I would have laughed. But life has a funny way of surprising us, of teaching us lessons we didn't even know we needed to learn." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Flower Garden taught me that true wealth is not in bank accounts or skyscrapers. It's in people, in stories, in the roots we plant, and the wings we give each other to fly." Laura Santos, to whom we dedicate this festival, understood this deeply. She saw beauty where others saw decay, potential where others saw obstacles. Richard looked at Michael, who was watching him with bright eyes. "Today, thanks to Laura's vision, to the courage of every resident of this neighborhood, and to the energy of a new generation of dreamers, we are building not just buildings, but a future. A future where progress and preservation go hand in hand, where success is measured not just in profits, but in transformed lives." As Richard concluded his speech, a gentle breeze blew through the square, making the leaves of the trees dance. To many present, it almost seemed as if Laura was there, smiling, approving every word. The festival was a resounding success. For a week, Flower Garden became a living laboratory of ideas and innovations. Lectures, workshops, and guided tours showed the world the transformative power of architecture when allied with social and environmental awareness. On the closing night, as fireworks lit up the sky, Richard, Michael, and Helena observed the scene from the house's porch. "So you know," said Helena, her voice laden with emotion, "I'm sure Laura is seeing all of this and she must be so proud." Michael, with tears in his eyes, hugged his father and grandmother. "Thank you," he whispered, "for making her dream come true." Richard, feeling his heart overflow with love and gratitude, looked at the starry sky. Flower Garden had become more than a revitalization project. It was a living testimony that, with love, vision, and perseverance, it was possible to build a better world. And as the last shooting star streaked across the sky, Richard made a silent promise to continue this legacy, not just for Flower Garden, but for every community that needed hope and renewal. The future, he realized, was bright, full of possibilities, and they would build it together one brick at a time. 1 year had passed since the Laura Santos Sustainable Architecture Festival, and the impact of the event reverberated far beyond the borders of Flower Garden. The neighborhood had become a national reference point in urban revitalization and sustainability, attracting visitors from all over the country and even from abroad. On a sunny Saturday morning, Richard walked through the neighborhood alongside Michael, now 13 years old. The boy had grown not only in stature but in maturity and vision. His eyes shone with the same passion that once inhabited Laura's. "Dad, look!" Michael pointed excitedly to a group of university students who were photographing and taking notes in front of one of the restored buildings. "It's the third group of visitors just this week." Richard smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "It's incredible how Flower Garden has become an example for so many people, isn't it?" They continued walking, greeting residents and visitors along the way. The neighborhood pulsed with vibrant energy. New businesses had emerged, cultural spaces flourished, and the sense of community was palpable in the air. When they reached the central square, they were greeted by Helena, who was animatedly talking with a group of people. "Ah, good thing you arrived," Helena exclaimed, waving for them to approach. "I want to introduce you to someone very special." Richard and Michael joined the group, and Helena made the introductions. "This is Dr. Carlos Mendonça from UN Habitat. He came to see our project in person." The middle-aged man smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Mr. Mendez, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. The work you've done here is truly inspiring." Richard shook the visitor's hand, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "The pleasure is ours, Dr. Mendonça, but the credit goes to the entire community." The UN representative nodded, looking around with admiration. "That's exactly what makes Flower Garden so special. It's not just a top-down project, but a true collaboration between company, community, and government." Michael, who was listening attentively, couldn't contain his curiosity. "Did you come from so far just to see our neighborhood?" Dr. Mendonça smiled at the boy. "Actually, young man, I came for something even bigger. We're organizing an international conference on sustainable cities, and we'd like Flower Garden to be presented as a case study." Richard and Helena exchanged surprised looks. "That's an incredible honor," Richard managed to say. "More than that," continued Dr. Mendonça, "we'd like to invite you to share your experience. The world needs to hear this story." In the weeks that followed, Flower Garden was in a flurry with preparations for the conference. Residents, Mendez Incorporation's employees, and the young interns from the architecture program worked together to compile data, prepare presentations, and above all, tell the story of the neighborhood's transformation. One night, as Richard reviewed some documents in his home office, Michael entered silently carrying a photo album. "Dad, can I show you something?" Richard smiled, gesturing for his son to approach. Michael opened the album, revealing old photos of the neighborhood, many of them taken by Laura. "Grandma gave me this album," Michael explained. "They're photos that Mom took over the years, showing what the neighborhood was like before. I thought we could use them in the conference presentation, you know, to show the complete journey." Richard flipped through the pages, feeling a lump in his throat. Each photo was a testament to Laura's love for Flower Garden, to her vision of what the neighborhood could become. "It's a brilliant idea, son," he said, pulling Michael into a hug. "Your mother would be so proud of you." On the day of the conference, the auditorium was packed. Representatives from governments, NGOs, and companies from around the world eagerly awaited to hear about the miracle of Flower Garden. When Richard took the stage, accompanied by Helena and Michael, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also a deep gratitude. He looked at the audience and began, "The story we've come to share today is not just about architecture or urban planning. It's a story about redemption, about second chances, and about the transformative power of love and community." As he spoke, images of the neighborhood, before and after, were projected on the screen behind him. Laura's photos blended with recent images, visually telling the evolution of Flower Garden. Michael, overcoming his initial nervousness, took the microphone to talk about the internship program and how young architects were contributing to the project. His passion and eloquence captivated the audience. Helena, in turn, detailed the technical aspects of the revitalization, emphasizing the importance of historical preservation allied with sustainable innovation. At the end of the presentation, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Questions were asked, contacts exchanged, and seeds of new projects planted. Later, in a moment of quietude after the frenzy of the day, Richard, Helena, and Michael found themselves on the hotel balcony, observing the city lights. "You know," Helena said softly, "Laura always said that a good idea was like a seed in the wind. You plant it in one place, but you never know where it will germinate." Richard nodded, feeling a deep emotion. "And look at how many seeds we planted today." Michael, his eyes shining with the enthusiasm of youth and wisdom beyond his years, smiled. "And we still have a lot to plant, don't we, Dad?" Richard hugged his son, feeling that Laura's legacy, and now theirs, was in good hands. Flower Garden was just the beginning. The real journey of spreading hope and transformation throughout the world was just beginning. As the night progressed, the three remained there, dreaming of the infinite possibilities that the future held, not just for them, but for all the communities their example could touch and transform. 5 years passed since the international conference. Flower Garden was no longer just a revitalized neighborhood, but a living symbol of urban and social transformation. The sustainable development model created there had been replicated in several cities in Brazil and around the world, always adapted to local realities. Richard, now 50 years old, walked through the neighborhood streets on an autumn morning. His graying temples and the lines on his face told the story of a life full of challenges and achievements. He stopped in front of the old neighborhood association mansion, now transformed into a vibrant cultural and social innovation center. "Mr. Richard," called a familiar voice. It was Donna Zulaide, now a white-haired lady, but still with the same sparkle in her eyes. "Here for the grand opening?" Richard smiled, nodding. "Wouldn't miss it for anything, Donna Zulaide." The grand opening she referred to was the official inauguration of the Laura Santos Institute for Sustainable Architecture and Community Development, a dream that started as a small seed years ago and now became a reality. Inside the renovated building, the excitement was palpable. Students from various parts of the country and the world circulated through the corridors, eager for the start of classes. On the walls, an exhibition told the story of Flower Garden, from the times when Laura dreamed of its revitalization to the present day. Richard found Helena in her new office. At 75, she had become an internationally respected figure in the field of sustainable urban revitalization. Her completely white hair framed a face marked by wisdom and the joy of a life well lived. "Ah, Richard," she smiled, hugging him. "I can hardly believe this day has come." "Laura would be so proud," Richard replied, his voice choked with emotion. At that moment, Michael entered the room. At 18, he was the living image of Laura. The same bright eyes, the same charismatic smile. Recently graduated from high school, he was preparing to begin his studies in architecture and urban planning. "Dad, Grandma," he called, excited. "It's time." Everyone's waiting in the auditorium. The three walked together to the large auditorium filled with students, teachers, neighborhood residents, and special guests. When they took the stage, they were greeted by a wave of warm applause. Richard approached the microphone, feeling the weight of the moment. 6 years ago, I was a different man. A man who measured success only in numbers and profits. But fate, or perhaps the love of a woman I had left behind, had other plans for me. He paused, looking at Michael and Helena. Flower Garden taught me that true wealth is in the connections we create, in the lives we touch, in the communities we strengthen. Laura Santos understood this deeply. And today, with the opening of this institute, her dream gains wings to fly even further. Michael took the word next, his voice strong and full of passion. This institute is not just a place of learning. It's a living laboratory of ideas, a space where the past and future meet to create a better present. Here we will learn not only to build buildings, but to build communities, to preserve stories while we write new chapters. Helena concluded the ceremony with words of wisdom. Each brick of this institute carries with it a story. Laura's story, Flower Garden's story, the story of each one of you who believed it was possible to make a difference. May the lessons learned here spread like seeds in the wind, transforming cities and lives all over the world. After the ceremony, as guests explored the Institute's facilities, Richard, Helena, and Michael found a moment of quietude in the rooftop garden. From there, they had a panoramic view of Flower Garden and the city beyond. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Michael reflected, his eyes scanning the horizon. How an idea, a dream, can grow and transform into something so big. Richard put his hand on his son's shoulder. That's how we change the world, Michael. One dream, one action, one person at a time. Helena smiled, her eyes misty. Laura always said that architecture wasn't just about building structures, but about building possibilities. Look at all of this. How many possibilities we've created together. As the sun set over São Paulo, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the three remained there, united by love, Laura's legacy and the promise of a bright future. Flower Garden, once destined for demolition, now flourished as a beacon of hope and inspiration. Richard looked at Michael, seeing in him not only Laura's reflection, but also the promise of an even brighter future. And at that moment, he knew with certainty that the circle was complete. What had begun as a story of loss and redemption had transformed into a legacy of love, transformation, and eternal hope. Flower Garden would continue to flourish, its roots deep and its flowers always turned towards the sun, inspiring future generations to dream, build, and transform the world, one neighborhood at a time. As the years passed, the Laura Santos Institute for Sustainable Architecture and Community Development became a beacon of innovation and social change. Students from all corners of the globe flocked to Flower Garden, eager to learn not just about sustainable architecture, but about the power of community-driven development. Michael, now 25, had graduated with honors and was quickly making a name for himself in the world of sustainable urban design. His first major project, an eco-friendly, affordable housing complex in a struggling neighborhood of São Paulo, had won international acclaim and was being studied as a model for similar developments worldwide. One crisp autumn morning, Richard, now in his late 50s with silver hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived, sat in his office at the Institute. He was reviewing plans for the Institute's latest initiative, a global network of sustainable community development hubs inspired by the Flower Garden model. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Helena, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, her eyes twinkling with the same passion that had driven her all these years. "Richard," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice, "you won't believe who's here to see us." Following her into the conference room, Richard was surprised to see a familiar face, Dr. Carlos Mendonça from UN Habitat, the man who had invited them to present at the international conference all those years ago. But he wasn't alone. With him was a striking young woman with piercing green eyes and an air of quiet determination. "Mr. Mendes," Dr. Mendonça greeted warmly, "it's wonderful to see you again. Allow me to introduce Amara Okafor, the new head of our Sustainable Cities initiative." Richard shook hands with Amara, immediately struck by the intensity of her gaze. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Okafor. What brings you to Flower Garden?" Amara smiled, her voice carrying a slight Nigerian accent. "Mr. Mendes, what you've accomplished here is nothing short of revolutionary. The Flower Garden model has inspired similar projects in cities across Africa, Asia, and South America, but we believe it's time to take it to the next level." Over the next hour, Amara laid out an ambitious plan. The UN was proposing a global initiative to identify and transform struggling urban areas using the principles developed in Flower Garden. They wanted the Laura Santos Institute to be at the heart of this effort, providing expertise, training, and on-the-ground support. "We're calling it Project Bloom," Amara explained, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "The idea is to create a network of flower gardens around the world, each adapted to its local context, but all sharing the core principles of sustainable, community-driven development." Richard listened, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. The scale of what Amara was proposing was staggering. It would mean expanding their operations far beyond anything they had ever imagined. "This is incredible," he said finally, "but it's also a massive undertaking. I'm not sure we have the resources or capacity to—" He was interrupted by another knock on the door. Michael entered, looking slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late," he apologized. "I just got back from the site visit in Rio and—" He stopped short, noticing the visitors. Richard made the introductions, watching as Michael's eyes widened in recognition at Dr. Mendonça's name. As Amara began to explain Project Bloom again, Richard saw the same fire ignite in his son's eyes that he had seen in Laura's so many years ago. "This is exactly what we've been working towards," Michael said excitedly when Amara finished. "Dad, don't you see? This is our chance to truly scale up what we've learned, to make a real difference on a global level." Richard looked from Michael to Helena, seeing the enthusiasm mirrored in both their faces. He thought of Laura, of her dream to change the world one community at a time. He thought of all the lives that had been transformed in Flower Garden and of the potential to replicate that transformation around the world. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to Amara and Dr. Mendonça. "We're in," he said simply. "Tell us what you need." The room erupted in smiles and handshakes, and, as they began to discuss next steps, Richard felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced when he first decided to save Flower Garden instead of demolishing it. It was the feeling of being part of something greater than himself, of building a legacy that would outlive him. Over the next few years, Project Bloom began to take root in cities around the world. From the favelas of Rio de Janeiro to the slums of Mumbai, from abandoned neighborhoods in Detroit to struggling communities in Nairobi, the principles of the Flower Garden model were being adapted and implemented. Michael became the face of the project, traveling tirelessly to oversee new developments and train local teams. His youthful energy and innovative ideas, combined with Richard's experience and Helena's wisdom, made for a formidable team. One particularly challenging project was in Lagos, Nigeria. The neighborhood, known locally as Dust Bowl due to its dry, barren landscape, had been written off by many as a lost cause. But Amara, who had grown up in a similar neighborhood, was determined to see it transformed. Richard, Michael, and a team from the Institute spent months working with local community leaders, government officials, and young Nigerian architects and urban planners. They faced numerous obstacles: bureaucratic red tape, skepticism from some residents, and the sheer scale of the challenges they faced. But slowly, surely, Dust Bowl began to change. Green spaces emerged where there had been only dirt. Solar panels appeared on rooftops, providing clean energy to homes that had never had reliable electricity. A community center, designed by a team of local architects mentored by Michael, became a hub of activity and learning. On the day of the official opening of the renewed neighborhood, now renamed Eden Grove by its residents, Richard stood back and watched as Michael gave interviews to local and international media. His son spoke passionately about the power of community-driven development, about the importance of preserving local culture while embracing sustainable innovation. As he listened, Richard felt a presence beside him. It was Helena, leaning on her cane but still standing tall. "He reminds me so much of Laura," she said softly. "The same fire, the same belief that we can make the world better, one neighborhood at a time." Richard nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. She would be so proud of him, of all of this. Helena squeezed his hand. "She is proud, Richard. I can feel it. And she's proud of you too. Look at what you've built, what you've inspired." As the sun set over Eden Grove, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Richard looked out over the transformed neighborhood. Children played in the new park, elderly residents chatted on benches under shade trees, and young people gathered at the community center for evening classes. He thought of Flower Garden, of the journey that had brought them here. What had started as one man's quest for redemption had blossomed into a global movement, touching lives and transforming communities around the world. And yet, even as Project Bloom continued to expand, even as their work gained recognition and accolades, Richard knew that the heart of their mission remained the same. It was about people, about communities, about creating spaces where hope could take root and flourish. As night fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Richard made a silent promise. To Laura, to Michael, to every person whose life had been touched by their work. He promised to keep nurturing this vision, to keep planting seeds of hope and change for as long as he was able. For he knew now more than ever that true wealth wasn't measured in money or property, but in the lives improved, the communities strengthened, and the legacy of positive change left behind. And that was a wealth beyond measure. The story of Flower Garden of Richard, Laura, Michael, and Helena would continue to inspire generations to come. It was a testament to the power of second chances, of the transformative nature of love and community, and of the endless possibilities that arise when we dare to dream of a better world. As Richard looked up at the starry sky over Eden Grove, he smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace and purpose. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that with each obstacle overcome, with each life touched, they were building a brighter future, one neighborhood at a time. And somewhere, he was sure, Laura was smiling too. Years passed, and Project Bloom continued to flourish across the globe. Richard, now in his 70s, had taken a step back from the day-to-day operations, but his vision and passion still guided the organization. Michael, in his 40s, had become a renowned figure in sustainable urban development, carrying forward his parents' legacy with unwavering dedication. On a warm summer evening, Richard sat on the porch of his home in Flower Garden, surrounded by his family. Michael was there with his wife and 2 children, and Helena, now in her 90s but still sharp as ever, sat in her favorite rocking chair. They had gathered to celebrate Richard's 75th birthday. As they shared stories and laughter, Richard couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. Flower Garden, once on the brink of demolition, was now a thriving, vibrant community and a model for sustainable urban living worldwide. The Laura Santos Institute had branches in every continent, nurturing the next generation of socially conscious architects and urban planners. Michael's daughter Laura, named after the grandmother she never met, tugged at Richard's sleeve. "Grandpa," she said, her eyes shining with curiosity, "tell us again how it all started." Richard smiled, looking around at his family. He began the tale, recounting the story of a man blinded by ambition, a woman with a vision, and a neighborhood that changed everything. As he spoke, he could almost feel Laura's presence, as if she were there with them, celebrating this moment. As the night grew late and the family began to disperse, Richard found himself alone on the porch. He gazed out at the neighborhood he had once sought to destroy and now loved so deeply. The streetlights twinkled like earthbound stars, and the soft murmur of community life floated on the warm breeze. He closed his eyes, feeling a profound sense of completion. The circle that began with his fateful decision years ago had come full circle. What started as a story of redemption had blossomed into a legacy of love, hope, and positive change that would endure long after he was gone. Richard took a deep breath, savoring the moment. He knew that his time was growing short, but he was at peace. He had lived a life of purpose, had seen his mistakes transformed into triumphs, and had helped create a better world for generations to come. As he opened his eyes, he saw a shooting star streak across the sky. In that moment, he felt a gentle warmth envelop him, as if Laura was there wrapping him in her embrace. And he knew with absolute certainty that everything was as it should be. Richard Mendez, once a man driven solely by profit, had become a catalyst for change, a builder of communities, and a guardian of hope. His journey, intertwined with those of Laura, Michael, Helena, and countless others, had reshaped not just Flower Garden, but the very concept of urban development around the world. As he slowly stood up to go inside, Richard took one last look at the neighborhood he loved. "Thank you," he whispered, to Laura, to Flower Garden, to life itself. And with a contented smile, he turned and walked into his home, leaving behind a legacy that would continue to bloom for generations to come.